Welcome to Healing Together. I'm Nicholas Boileau. Today I'm talking with Anna Penenberg, whose book Dancing in the Narrows chronicles her descent into the underworld of Lyme disease treatment and her multi-year struggle to save her daughter Dana's life. Our discussion covers how Anna and Dana first recognized the illness, how they realized that Dana's doctor did not know what to do to help her, and some of the extraordinary treatments they tried as they nursed Dana back to health during over a decade of struggle and experimentation. So without further delay, here's Anna Penenberg. Why don't we start with a brief introduction of you and your family and the elevator version of what you went through with your daughter, Dana.
So I was going along as a single parent with two daughters. My youngest daughter was 16 at the time, and she got what seemed to be a flu or something. She had maybe a little fever and achiness, and it went on for longer than 24 hours. Then it was a week, and she just seemed to be getting worse. A lot of fatigue and not being able to go to school. And so we began this very long journey that we had no idea we were going on. And she was diagnosed with a number of things. A 16-year-old, maybe you have mono, and the time kept extending and the diagnoses kept getting longer, fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. So she just was really unable to get off the couch for months and months. And eventually, we really couldn't figure out what was making her sick. And we ventured out into some other alternative medicines to help with the diagnosis, actually, and at least to help with her symptoms. And in the process, symptoms became longer, the list was longer, and many more things were happening with her. So she missed a whole semester of school by then. And then it took about a year and a half for me to compile the symptom list and realized online that even though she'd been tested for Lyme disease, she had gotten false negatives. And finally, we got a positive Lyme test. And at that point, we were willing to listen to the doctors who were familiar with treating Lyme disease. If you have just gotten your tick bite, the recommendation is to take the antibiotics, doxycycline, and do a round of that. And that usually helps people and prevents the long-term illness. But for Dana, she was already involved in the chronic phase of this Lyme disease. And so we were starting to learn about that. We did do some of the antibiotics, and this whole journey took 12 years altogether. My book covers about 8 years of our family experience. And we did, because her body wasn't responding to the antibiotics, even the IV antibiotic protocol, we eventually went out into various therapies, acupuncture treatments, ozone. Some of that was in Mexico. We did sonic treatments that were sound therapy sessions, and that definitely had an effect on her system, but it didn't resolve the infections. So we were looking to support her immune system any way that we could that might not involve more pharmaceutical medicine. And we also ventured into medicinal diet that would rebuild and replenish her system and help her immune to fight off what she had or balance her system so that it could function well.
Having read the book, it was really an eye-opener into what you call the underworld of Lyme disease treatment, I think. And I didn't actually read the first page of the book, the title, until after I read the book. And it was interesting because going through the journey with you and Dana, I really did feel like you were venturing into places I wouldn't want to go. The word underworld, which I actually saw at the end, was the right word to describe what journey you took me through as a reader. Can you say a little bit about why you called it an underworld?
We felt alone a lot. And in those days, there wasn't as much online and there wasn't Instagram. And we had some Facebook support. My daughter was typically the youngest person that she could find. She began at 16 to be ill. And so it was mostly adults and not people living at home with their parents. So the underworld means that, we had to invent things to try because the protocols with the Lyme doctors were pharmaceutical plus a lot of supplements to support this and support that. And so there was long lists of pills and supplements and pharmaceuticals to take along with the antibiotics. When we went outside of that, we were looking for ways in which the body could be supported and the whole system actually could come back into alignment and not have to add the burden of processing oral medicines that would then also tax the organs and add more stress to the system. Because Dana had, by then, she was operating with a very hypersensitive nervous system. She couldn't tolerate sound, light, and touch. It was very uncomfortable for her. So we really were looking for things that would not add burden to her system, but would help right it and use the intelligence of the human biosystem.
You talk about nobody believing that Dana was sick and some of your friends accusing you of indulging her. This is a topic we brush up against often on the podcast when people suffer from what might be called invisible illnesses. Maybe they're suffering from things that aren't culturally accepted yet as an official disease. For instance, let's say you get a cancer diagnosis. You immediately get a lot of compassion and patience from your community. But in the case of Lyme, I myself have a doctor friend who just doesn't believe it. Like he'll say with a straight face to me, Lyme is cured by a course of antibiotics, period. And this whole cultural phenomena around Lyme disease treatment, is a bunch of quacks leveraging the fact that people don't necessarily feel great after they're done with Lyme, but they are done with Lyme, he'll say. What is your advice for people who deal with something like what I would call an invisible or less accepted disease, and with it a chronic condition or many chronic conditions, and yet their community doesn't necessarily buy into the fact that they're actually suffering?
So I find this a lot with autoimmune conditions. They're complex, they're physical, they're emotional, there is real pain involved. There can be politically different parts of the medical system, those that are treating it and those that are limited in their treatment. In the case of Lyme, the infectious disease doctors treat you with a round of antibiotics, and then they say that whatever you have now is post-Lyme. I wasn't willing to work with that because I had a 16, 17, 18-year-old daughter who was going to have a life of post-Lyme, and she couldn't function. So the Lyme literate doctors do treat it. And again, with these invisible illnesses, there isn't any one right protocol for all people. Your immune system is an indicator of how your body's working with itself, and no exact same medicine works on every person's system. You can approach it, but so in a way you're having trials to see if this will help and if this will get you farther along. And it's complex because when you get that sick, many things are going on, and it may not just be the bacteria. There's joint issues and inflammation and nervous system conditions. The thing with some autoimmune illnesses is some of your labs look pretty good and you actually look okay. if you're smiling and if you have some energy, but you don't look like, you have a broken arm or something is obviously amiss, and or you've, lost a ton of weight and you don't look well. Typically, people with Lyme look fine, but they do not feel fine.
And based on your book, Dana's labs were not necessarily always great. And she definitely didn't always look great, right?
She looked pretty good. Even with the inflammation, I remember a doctor saying to her as he was like touching her arm or something, she was pretty inflamed all over and felt like it was uncomfortable to move easily. And he's like, you're not swollen. And she was so mad that he just didn't listen to what she was actually feeling or believe it.
There's a powerful moment where you're with a Dr. Marcus. I don't know if you're using real names or not, but this doctor is really condescending and proposing what you know to be the wrong treatments. And you decide at this point to take Dana's health into your own hands. Can you talk a little about that and how you had this aha moment where you said what you understood is, quote, they just don't know what to do?
He was actually an integrative doctor, which was quite nice, but he had treated her with acupuncture and IV nutrients, and he expected her to bounce back because she was 16. It was early on in the illness, and she wasn't getting better. And months were going by, and it wasn't resolving. He decided that because of her symptoms of the achiness and everything, that maybe antidepressants would pull her out of the pain and the problem. And I didn't believe that. I didn't believe that if we gave her more medicine and not had figured out what the core of the problem was in her system, that she would ultimately get better. And he incensed me a little bit because he said, would you not give your daughter insulin if she had diabetes? And so I was still asking questions. Well, what's wrong with her gut? Why is she having these kinds of symptoms? And so I realized that in all earnestness, he was trying to help, but I didn't think that was a good road. And I was determined to figure out what was wrong with my daughter because I knew her and I knew she was telling the truth.
And he seemed determined to believe that the problem was between her ears.
I think that's very common. A lot of people with Lyme disease end up with psychopharmacology because they're having a lot of emotional difficulty and depression and sometimes anxiety and anger, which Dana wasn't having, but she was losing a lot and we were having a very isolated life, only the beginning of it. And so she was, we were frightened and worried, but I didn't think that antidepressants would give us the basis of whatever was going to help her return to wellness. So I very boldly, but maybe, kind of naively just said, we have to go elsewhere and we have to look for something that's more holistic that's going to help you feel better.
Let's remember that you're doing this over a period of years. And there are numerous moments in the book when you talk about how brittle you feel, how close to breaking, like when Dana drains the car battery by charging her iPod, and many other times when you're trying to hide your brittleness and exhaustion from her. Can you dig a little bit into that dynamic?
Yes, Dana was highly sensitive to my levels of expression. Either, joy even was a little hard for her because it was too much energy. And so because of her hypersensitivity, I had learned to be sort of even around her, just not to kind of infringe on her more fragile kind of field in herself or burden her with my emotions when she had so many of her own that she couldn't really always digest. In that scene, I go behind the building and I'm just letting all my frustrations out so that when I get back to the car, I'm a little more even energy.
And what does that look like when you're letting your frustrations out? Is that I'm behind the building crying, or I'm behind the building just breathing or screaming?
Well, I probably would have screamed, but I was concerned that someone would hear me and maybe even her around the corner. So I just like pressed into the stucco, like my hand, just pressing as hard as I could because I wanted to kind of get my energy moving out of me and back to calm, because whatever was going to happen, I had gotten someone to assist us with recharging the battery and starting the car, and we were just going to have to wait. But I think I suddenly also realized, even more so, that I had taken a very sick child on a road trip, and maybe this was not such a good plan. But the purpose was to take her to a clinic and also to get her out of the house so she could feel like a person for a while. I was very responsible for keeping her as best I could in a healing mode while not shutting myself down and kind of losing myself.
Healing Together is sponsored by Healthenly. Healthenly brings together patients and caregivers who want to connect with people who've been there before.
Healthenly is a place to get mentorship from someone who's been through what you're going through. It's not a doctor's visit, but it's so much more than a social media group, which, let's face it, sometimes don't provide the meaningful hand-holding we want.
And social media can also feel like a place where you don't want to share what's really going on, because you never know what's going to come back at you. On Healthenly, you can find someone like you, we call them health angels, to provide advice and support and be your sounding board during a health challenge.
Like one health angel, Stacy, who joined Healthenly to guide and support other diabetics. She talks about how great it feels to use her own experience as a diabetic to help other people who are struggling.
When you think about it, it's amazing how many of us have real health knowledge that can make a difference for others. And I know when I'm dealing with a health issue, I just want to find someone who's been through the same thing.
Check it out. It's all free. Healthenly.org.
We recently had Dr. Cynthia Lee on the podcast, and she talked about how important it is for caregivers to take care of themselves. And I think about this 10-year period where you're taking care of someone else and really putting your life on hold in many ways. Looking back, are there things you wish you had done to make sure your life wasn't totally on pause?
No. It wasn't the journey I thought I was going to be on, where my practice was going to grow and the kids would graduate and go off to college, and I would be more independent and they would be too. And so what I realized with Dana was that we were in something that was way bigger than us, and it was teaching us a lot. For a long time in the beginning of the illness, I really had to advocate for her, speak for her, remember what had gone on with her, to tell the practitioners and the doctors, because she had a lot of brain fog. I found myself amassing a whole new set of skills, some based on previous things that I had done in my life and previous knowledge that I'd had. You know, I had actually worked in a mental hospital for a while and part of my training. So I think that was another reason, going back to the antidepressants, where I kind of knew my way around some of that and could make a distinction. And so I kind of intrinsically trust life brings to you what you need to be doing here and will enhance your purpose.
That's a really important point, that wherever you are, this is the life you have, this is the moment you have, and you might as well be in it. And it's not so easy. So over a period of years, when you're taking care primarily of someone else and not yourself, are there kernels of wisdom you've learned during that time that you could advise other people, even though it's going to be different for everyone, about ways in which you can take care of yourself, even as you're really putting your life in service of someone else's health journey at this point?
I think one of the things that happens is, for a long time, I was responsible for making sure she took everything she was supposed to take and ate when she was supposed to, and that she was breathing well. And so your timing is kind of timed to the other person. And it's really important to grab those 10 minutes, even if you have to stay in the same room because you cannot leave. You can't leave them alone just in case the cannula slips from their nose or something like that. And just take some deep breaths and realign with yourself. Just small things, even just going out and picking a flower and bringing that in. I find moments of beauty, moments of breathing, those are kind of the most basic thing that you can do. If you can get some stretching in, that's great. If you can read a little, or, when Dana would go to bed, I would feel like I had at least maybe an hour before maybe something wouldn't go well and she couldn't sleep, or maybe I'd have more. And so I would stay up so I could read a book and just leave my little sphere and go into some other story. And that was very nice for me. Just taking those breaks in any way that you can.
And you're not the only one who needs care and attention. You also had another daughter. And there's this poignant moment in the book where she's returning from a trip abroad and she comes back with rickettsia, disease you don't get in the United States, and has to be hospitalized. In that moment, you had to balance the on-call every minute for Dana and the being home for Kayla. How does this devotion to caring for one person impact your other family relationships?
It's really complex, and I always felt like I was there for Kayla, but she was in a phase where just as Dana was getting really sick, she was graduating high school and going off to college and coming home on weekends. It was very scary for her what was happening to Dana. No one in our family ever got sick. We have a pretty healthy family. Somebody might get a cold on occasion, but nobody had anything that was taking months and then years. So she lost her relationship with her sister, basically, too. Dana couldn't visit her at college and see her new life. And when she would come home, things were organized around Dana and her comfort and because of her discomfort. Here she was, she went on a semester abroad and in Africa, and she somehow got bit by a tick and got Mediterranean spotted fever, rickettsia, and came home on the plane with spots all over her body and landed in the hospital. That is a more acute illness. It will, you do want to be on antibiotics and get through it, but it won't be chronic. It doesn't stay in your system. And she was having a dose of how Dana felt, which was something I could never arrange or would never arrange for her. But oddly enough, she was having an experience of what was happening to Dana on a long-term basis. And so they were, by the time Kayla came home from the hospital, they were both like with the, blackout curtains and sensitive to light and healing from a tick-borne thing. And I think in some way that provided this miraculous moment where Kayla could identify with Dana. And it helped because she got to get well and had a lot more compassion for what Dana was going through.
And I imagine compassion for you as Dana's caregiver.
Yeah.
In the book, you have these chapters where you go to different practitioners. You went to Mexico for ozone treatments. You went to Las Vegas for sonic treatments. I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg here. It really was a journey through a medical underworld. And as the treatments kept getting weirder, I kept thinking, oh, God, no, not again. Now they're going to Mexico. Can you talk about a couple of the more out there treatments you tried? And if you have any warnings against what you can now verifiably say is not worth someone's time and money, or if you don't, how you feel about the extent to which you went to find something that would work for Dana.
All right. I guess I end up feeling that it's really such a personal journey because some of these things are quite worthy of seeing if they will help you. If you could know beforehand, that would be even better. But people are using ozone in a variety of ways. It's still pretty prominent in the alternative treatment world for Lyme disease. The one we did was more extensive and was kind of like a treatment that took an hour and recycled through all of your blood. It stood the chance of taking down the infection. Some of these things are particular to how much and how often, and you have to kind of do trials to see if you have that mix going in the best possible way. I guess I end up feeling that everything we did helped to some degree and then was not the whole treatment needed. The sonic treatment worked very well for another young woman, and he was kind enough to treat Dana without charging us because it worked very well for rheumatoid issues. And people with Lyme were coming because they had also had a lot of joint and pain in their body. The woman that we knew, that's how she got well. We were like, well, let's see if this works for you. And it was doing something, but it wasn't making her feel better. It definitely, I think, was killing the bacteria.
And just to be clear, Anna, some of these treatments, they're pretty serious treatments. Like when you say we had to cycle through all her blood for the ozone treatments, she's actually hooked up to a machine and her blood is leaving her body and then coming back into her body with the additional ozone.
Correct.
This is not unlike a dialysis machine where your blood is pulled out of your body and filtered and then put back in your body.
Right. And it is kind of similar because it's also filtered. And one thing you can actually visually see is that the toxins are being filtered out. And there would literally be this jar of foam and other things that would come out of her blood. And she would feel somewhat lighter from that. But ozone also creates a certain level of oxygen in the blood that is an unhappy environment for spirochete bacteria. And so they would die off, and the die-off doesn't really feel that great.
But the skeptic in me wants to ask, weren't you terrified looking at that jar of foamy leftovers? Weren't you at all concerned that some of those foamy leftovers might actually have been essential nutrients or chemicals that shouldn't be removed from her body?
No, it concerned me because I realized that her lymph, and we kind of knew this, her lymph system wasn't working that well, and this was a big relief. But the goal would be to have the lymph system operate and do what it should be doing in processing and removing things.
So you had confidence that it was actually doing something helpful?
Yes.
I had another reaction when reading the book where it felt like with every challenging treatment and every frightening physiological response, no matter what was happening to Dana post-treatment, even if her suffering had increased, the practitioner would say some version of, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. It means Dana's body is getting rid of the toxins. Many times in the book, I would roll my eyes and say, they're all saying that no matter what she's going through.
Well, with one of the doctors, I just kind of knew that was his mantra anyway, and I didn't really take it too seriously. But the complex issue with treating Lyme disease, if you are attempting to eradicate the bacteria, is that it will put out these neurotoxins into the system. Getting better from Lyme is like feeling worse while you're doing it. And so it's very confusing. I mean, there's such a thing called a Herxheimer. So you'll have, if you go too fast, you'll have this big reaction, which is a detox reaction. So I think that's why people said that a lot. Ultimately, we were interested in finding a treatment that wasn't targeted on killing, but was targeted to help the system, use its own intelligence and the immune system improve, and therefore deal with the biome, the terrain that is inhabiting, that is useful, and some that is overpopulated. And of course, the Lyme bacteria was overpopulated.
During this whole time, during these years, there are a few times when you go off and do something for yourself. And that can be a very small thing, like taking a bath with a good book, or something bigger, like leaving the house to visit friends for the evening, or even for a full night. You describe going to have Thanksgiving with your family of origin, your siblings. In the book, each time you are leaving, and again, whether it's nearby or far away, it feels inevitable that you get a call from Dana, who's thinking she's seriously ill or dying at that very moment. And often at the worst moment for you, as you're experiencing something different or getting a breath of fresh air. I would put myself in the shoes of maybe a friend of yours, and I really wanted to say enough already. I almost felt like you were enabling her. And yet, at the same time, she was going through something very real. Can you just talk a little bit about that dynamic?
So I think it's really hard for people to understand what can happen in the dynamics of a relationship that is so very much dependent on one another. She had a very dire illness. There was never a good time for me to ever be not in the room, actually. So it was maybe not so smart for me to ever leave. During that moment, I had a very close neighbor in charge of helping Dana while I was gone, and she was lovely, and Dana really liked her. Dana also was maybe 20 years old at that moment and kind of wanted her own independence, wanted me to go. We'd missed so many Thanksgivings, and she really couldn't do it, so she wanted me to go.
So she encouraged you to leave the house.
Yeah, because she also wanted some independence, which she had sorely been not having. And she really attained like a nurse practitioner level of administering her own IV antibiotics. So she was still doing that during that visit that I took. And she was about 5 months into it. And what I didn't realize is maybe it was just getting worse and worse. It wasn't feeling good. And there was days that she could take off. They were starting to pulse the IV antibiotics, 4 days on, 3 days off. And that seemed to give her some time to recover a little bit in between. And the doctors were starting to try that as a protocol. So I leave, and I always, whenever I went, which I rarely did, once a year I took a week off, I always would be in touch with her. But this time, I think she just was alone, and it was scary, and her head was really hurting. And it just seemed to be the end of the IV antibiotic regimen. There was a question whether she should go to the emergency room, which I never wanted her to do because I didn't really trust what they would give her and if it would make her worse, because steroids certainly do make the whole thing worse. So I thought she handled it well. We ultimately decided for her not to go in an ambulance, just get off the antibiotics. There's a very brave part of her who really was trying to be independent, but dealing with pretty hard to manage all by yourself protocol that she was on. Later, she goes off to college and manages all of her treatments herself, which was somewhat liberating to both of us and also very scary.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that time towards the end of her illness, or at least the beginning of her wellness. And when she was achieving some level of independence, you write, but there was no badge, no graduation with honors, no job waiting, nothing to fill the huge hole in my life. So here's Dana taking off, getting on the on-ramp to life and back into the world she wanted to be in. But you suddenly, you've been focused single-mindedly on her wellness. You have nothing to do with all that. You have to shift gears in a major way. Do you have any recommendations for people who have helped someone through an illness and might find it therapeutic to either continue using that knowledge even if it's no longer needed for the original patient or sufferer, or on the other hand, might need to move on. How do you do that when you're suddenly like, my patient is gone and my hands are empty?
Yeah, actually, it turned out to be more than that. And I'm sort of a researcher of relational things, and I kind of watched myself, and what I realized is that I was totally traumatized by the whole experience, which you can imagine. And so I was kind of interested, like, how do I unwind that? Because that has to get unwound maybe first before I decide how to use my new knowledge and what to do in my life. I spent a lot of time just healing, feeling the grief. There's a lot of grief that you don't feel when you're in the throes of survival, but afterwards, the various losses and the years that you might have done something else, or the people you would have been in touch with, but the illness precluded us being social. And so all of that grief I had to feel it and then move on. I couldn't just be traumatized and moving forward with my life. And so actually writing the book was very healing for me. And I think instructive in some way about how a major illness and a chronic illness brings about its own issues of trauma.
How are things looking for Lyme disease patients right now? Do you feel there are adequate resources being put into it and that we're getting closer to having effective and accepted treatment regimens?
I pretty much follow LymeDisease.org. They have a big platform where people with Lyme can add themselves to the data, my Lyme data. It's complex and it's, as I said, somewhat different in everybody's system. And so I don't know that there's going to be one foolproof thing. And they also once tried a vaccine, but that really ended up having more trouble than helping. You can stay up on what's new and what's being used and what they are learning on the internet. And Tick Boot Camp has a lot of very vital information always for anyone who has Lyme disease. I feel very fortunate that there is such good help on the internet if you're looking for that kind of information.
Do you feel that there's a more general acceptance of Lyme disease as a chronic condition?
These conflicts continue in the medical world. The CDC says post-Lyme, and then you can take sleeping pills and painkillers and things like that. So you don't have it, but you have something as a result. The other team is trying to resolve the whole system and return someone to their optimal health. And maybe not believing that the infections are completely gone. And even if they are, that's always very hard to tell. And Lyme is just an amazingly intelligent bacteria and will hide and come back in various ways and protect itself with biofilms. And so that's not one camp yet.
But based on your experience, you're saying the bacteria are still there long after the regular allopathic medical world led by the CDC would say they're gone.
Right, because they only do one round of antibiotics and they consider that you've treated it. And the Lyme doctors do a whole lot more and have patients. Most patients never leave their practice. They're inundated. And then there's just people who seek out other ways of healing themselves. And there's a number of books written and people like me who've tried other things.
Right. And I have a feeling there's so many people out there who really appreciate the time you took after Dana left to actually write a book and document some of what you went through. Do you have time before we part for a few short answer questions?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a top recommendation for other caregivers so that they can maintain enough energy to do the hard work of caring for someone else?
I would recommend that you do what works for you. Things like eating well and really resting when you can, do things you love, listen to some music, do those short recovery moments when you can, the 10 minutes of breathing or whatever. I like yoga, so I would do my yoga. I might play a quiet mantra or beautiful melody or something quietly all night just for comfort, and just try to take good care of yourself, because if you aren't strong enough to keep going, then you're not helping the other person.
I feel that's a particularly wise recommendation, the 10-minute break, because most of us, when we have those 10 minutes, when we're waiting for someone or waiting for a bus, or, someone's not gotten their clothes on, so we have a few minutes just sitting in the kitchen, we tend to immediately look at our phone, read the latest headlines or respond to texts. And yet taking 10 minutes not doing anything as a real break can be much more therapeutic and can energize you for whatever's going to come next. Can you recommend an easy and healthy way to communicate with people who just don't get it or can't quite bring themselves to believe that this is real?
I remember when in the beginning I was doing all this research and I was just too much for most people. So pare it back, keep it simple, be kind, and bring them into kind of what it really feels like for the person who's dealing with the chronic condition and how you're helping them.
I think you're saying be compassionate even to people who don't buy into your story and don't believe you. Yeah, and that's probably the best way to reach people anytime they disagree with you, is to actually be compassionate about whatever they're thinking and help them along the path. Can you think of 2 or 3 things you would either not have done or have done differently if you could do it all over?
Well, oddly, I feel like we gave almost everything a try that we ever knew about. It's probably helpful no matter what to be on some anti-inflammatory diet. Try to keep a clean diet from pesticides and processed foods. Maybe bring down the sugar if that's an issue. And wheat seems to be pretty fraught in this country, not just because of the gluten factor, but just the processing of it and the pesticides. I think if you can add a clean focus to your diet and something that's not activating your system in an inflammatory way, that would be a really good thing.
I think there's a lot of research right now about foods that are more or less inflammatory to the human body. And there's a lot to discover there if you're not doing it already. Last question. How's your relationship with Dana now, and how's she doing?
She's doing great. She has blossomed into her own life. She's an amazing healer. It's almost as though it's not the university you want to send your kid to, but she had tried and had thought about and was involved so intimately with various treatments that she's well schooled in alternative healing. And she's pretty masterful as a cranial sacral and Reiki practitioner, and is now helping people who have chronic and pain and various conditions that she can really identify and help them. She and I have actually done some healing work together on adults and children, and we have an intimate relationship that might not have been carved out so intensely, and just a great respect for one another.
I have a belief that a lot of suffering is teaching us to help other people through their suffering. And I think a lot of illnesses can be translated into helping other people through those same illnesses or similar symptoms or conditions. I just want to remind people that the book is Dancing in the Narrows, a mother-daughter odyssey through chronic illness. And do you want to tell people where they can find you?
They can find me at annapenenberg.com, and my book is on Amazon, Dancing in the Narrows.
Thank you for spending this time with me.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
This is Nicholas. Before I leave you, I want to say something about Anna's book, Dancing in the Narrows. I particularly loved the chapter titles, such as Message from a Tree, and Moxie, and Labyrinth. Each chapter title was followed by a quote, and I found myself wanting to print each quote in big letters to hang on the walls of my office. So I'll leave you with this one, a quote from Jack Kornfield which marks the beginning of chapter 17, Firefall. In the end, just 3 things matter. How well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Healing Together is produced by Healthenly. Our theme song is Ramble, composed and performed by Ed Morneau.